Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Ian Golding is the Executive Director, Knowledge and Academics at the Customer Institute, an independent, not-for-profit institution focused on best practice in customer experience. They offer a certification process that helps companies focus on customer centricity. Ian is a well-known global speaker and advisor on CX. He was recently ranked the number 2 most important CX influencer in the UK by CX magazine. Only the rock star James Dodkins beat him, and you can go back a few episodes in this podcast to find my conversation with James. Ian can often be found jetting around the world to deliver keynotes and run workshops on CX. And this week, he's actually right here in São Paulo, Brazil. So I caught up with him on the sidelines of the WOW CX Summit to ask how companies can deliver really great CX. Right, so about 18 months ago, I know that you published a book called Customer What? And one of the first checklists that I saw in the book was how to determine if your business is even ready to create a comprehensive CX strategy. How common is it that you still run into companies today that really just haven't even thought about building a strategy to this extent?
It is far more common than people might imagine. Not necessarily yourself, but others. And one of the reasons that I developed that model is because when I was an employee on the inside of organisations, I was constantly speaking to people who kept giving me the impression that I was completely barking mad. You know, what do we need to do this for? We do it already. We've had CRM for years. We don't need to do anything about the customer experience. And so the reality is that there are, I would say, more organisations that don't think they need to change than there are who do think there is the need to transform. And those who say they recognise the need to transform don't actually put any substance behind the words. So it is far more common than people would imagine. And the evidence that I use to bring to life that the reality is that whilst most organisations on earth today have a digital strategy, most still don't have a customer experience strategy. So it sort of gives you a good indication as to what businesses think is more important.
Yeah, and I guess that's why it was right up front in the book as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I know that this week you're in São Paulo speaking at the WOW CX Summit.
Yes.
Can you reveal any of the themes that you're covering either in your keynote or in the masterclasses you're hosting?
No, absolutely. Well, in fact, my theme of the moment, and I say of the moment, I've been preaching about it for about 2 years now, is the theme of customer journey management. The masterclasses that I deliver all around the world revolve around the importance of applying a very structured, intentional approach to being able to sustain the focus on customer experience. And one of the biggest mistakes that most organisations are making is that whilst they recognise what the customer journey is, there is still a failure to understand what to do with it. And so one of my mantras is that people need to stop thinking about customer journey mapping and focus on customer journey management. And that will be the topic of my keynote later today. I'm the last person on. I think that they're hoping people will stay until the very end if I'm the last person. And customer journey management is a series of interconnected, continuous activities that include knowing who the customer is, knowing what their journey looks like, measuring the journey to identify the small number of priorities having the greatest detrimental effect on customer perception and financial performance. And when you know what the priorities are, you then fix them. And then that cycle continues continuously, indefinitely, forever. And the reason I'm preaching about it and have done for the last couple of years or so is because so few organisations have embedded the journey as a living, breathing organism. They map it once and never look at it again. And so fundamentally, hardly any organisations are actively managing the improvement of the journey.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that being reflected in some of the numbers coming out of the UK. I mean, if you look
Yes.
at the latest Institute of Customer Service annual
Yep.
survey, then customer satisfaction in the UK is the lowest for 5 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what's going on?
Well, do you know, again, I have a lot of very bold perspectives on this kind of thing. And I have some bold perspectives because I'm in this very odd, fortunate and unusual position of travelling all around the world. And in fact, my visit to Brazil completes my visit to all of the continents apart from Antarctica, which I suspect I will never get to. And sadly, what I'm seeing is that there is a big difference between the so-called established markets and the so-called developing markets, both from an economic sense, but also from a customer experience maturity sense. And what I'm seeing is that in the US specifically, the UK and other parts of Western Europe, the approach to customer experience is going backwards. It's actually going backwards at a more rapid rate in the US. The UK, like everything, we always take a little bit of time to catch up with the US. But as the ICS data confirmed, we're starting to go backwards now as well. And the reason is that what I'm seeing is a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and apathy. There seems to be, and this is a generalization, but a view that we know what customer experience is all about and we're doing it already. And we don't need to learn anything else. When, quite frankly, we could not be further from the truth. Too many organizations in the Western world think they know what customer experience is because they've been talking about it for 10, 15 years. But in reality, they are still failing to understand the real science that sits behind it. And by contrast, I do a lot of work in Africa, I do a lot of work in Eastern Europe, I do a lot of work in the Middle East. And as I say, this is my first trip to Latin America. And what is very different in these parts of the world is that not only does there seem to be a real appetite to learn and acquire knowledge, there is also a real desire to do something with the knowledge. And one thing is constant in all of these parts of the world, and that is the level of education. It no longer matters which part of the world you come from, you are going to get education that is just as good as it is in the UK and the US. And so I think, in my opinion, based on what I'm seeing, if the US and parts of Western Europe don't actually wake up and smell the coffee, these other so-called less established markets will start to overtake them. It could take 2 years, it could take 10 years. But if we carry on as we are, that's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think personally, one of the things I notice in Brazil is how I can contact my barber, bank manager, book a hotel. I can do everything on WhatsApp, and I can't do that back in the UK.
That's right. And, and the irony is you go to the US, if you want to pay by credit card, in many places you still have to sign. I think it is an irony that everyone looks at the US for the best customer experience examples and case studies, which they do have. But it's the land of extremes. That they have the best examples and the very worst examples, and it is a curve that is very much more focused on the worst than the best.
And that's interesting, because this problem of customer satisfaction, I mean, it's going to mean that everyone that's working in customer experience, the people actually designing customer service, are going to have to work so much harder this year to prove their return on investment to the business.
Absolutely. Well, you say harder. I would say they've always had to try and fight to convince business leaders that there is a return on investment. But I think, again, there is a slight misunderstanding in the industry of customer experience, if I can call it that, as to where the real return comes from. And I think this is, again, a level of education that needs to change, because too many are assuming that the return on investment for customer experience comes from revenue generation. And it does come from revenue generation in the long term. customer experience is a long-term business strategy. And, if you are committed to it and you keep your focus on it in the long term, you will see a revenue benefit as a result. But the problem is that doesn't happen in 6 months. The short-term return for focusing on customer experience actually comes from cost reduction and cost avoidance. If an organization focuses on improving the customer experience, what it's focusing on is stopping things from going wrong, eliminating things that are upsetting customers, making what they do leaner and more efficient. And so the reality is that if there is a genuine, sincere approach to improving the experience, you will deliver a return immediately almost from eliminating the randomness in the experience. That's where the short-term return comes from. Revenue is much further forward, but not enough customer experience professionals are leveraging the elimination of the things that are going wrong as a way of describing the financial benefit of improving the customer experience.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And now I know that CX Magazine named you the number 2 influencer on CX in the
Yes.
UK. It was only the rock star James Dodkins who beat you, and
Yes.
he was also a recent guest on this podcast.
Yes.
I read their description of some of your writing, and they said specifically they liked your ideas around customer centricity as a key reason, why you're ranked so highly. Now, can you explain maybe why do some companies find it so hard to actually make their services customer centric, and the ones that succeed, what are they doing differently?
Yeah, it's I always say when I'm doing keynotes, so I may say it this evening, is that I get paid to state the blindingly obvious. The ridiculous thing is that I describe customer experience as a science, but it's not rocket science. And in fact, it really is not complicated. I think the problem is that to become a customer-centric organization, it relies on the leaders of a business recognizing that they need to create an environment that enables everyone to think and act in the interests of the customer. The problem is that many legacy businesses, the way they were created, the way they were structured so as to prevent people from thinking. We don't want you to think. We just want you to do what you're told. And regrettably, we are still living in a world where in the majority of cases, employees are not allowed to do, in inverted commas, the right thing. What they have to do is what they've been told to do. And very often they won't challenge what they've been told to do, either because they don't think they can or because they're scared to challenge. And the latest example of this, a really good example, which you may or may not have come across, is another US example. There is a bank in the US called US Bank. And on Christmas Eve, a customer contacted the contact center. He was standing outside a bank branch at the time because the bank wouldn't give him any money because his paycheck hadn't cleared. And so he was phoning the contact center to try and get his paycheck cleared because he had no cash and he desperately needed to put fuel in his car and various other things. To cut a long story short, he was on the phone to someone in this bank's contact center for over an hour. And the lady that he was speaking to took it upon herself to say, do you know what? Wait where you are. I'm going to come and see you. And so she went to her boss and said, do you mind if I pop out for half an hour? And he said, that's fine. And the customer was 14 miles away. She drove to see him and gave him $20 of her own money to put cash in his car because she wasn't going to be able to get this check cleared. The following week, she was called into a manager's office and fired. And she was fired because she'd gone against bank processes by going and giving the man $20. The irony is that she'd been awarded lots of recognition things by the bank for being a wonderful example of doing the right thing. And it's just a brilliant current example of how conflicted organizations are. If we're not prepared to trust people to do what is right, we will never see organizations become truly customer centric. And the reality is, the more customer centric the business, the more likely it is that it will see a financial return as a result and grow sustainably.
Yeah, it's like the agents in Zappos. You get encouraged to do the right thing that keeps the customer happy, rather than following a strict set of rules like a drone.
Yeah, exactly right. It's really not complicated, but it's. I think one of the mistake is the wrong word. One of the things I think the CX community has failed to do, and what is sort of sitting behind a lot of this failure to change, is that we have spent a long time over the last 20 years trying to convince people that run businesses that they need to change the way they think. But very often, people who run businesses, they themselves are being or doing what they've been told to do. Because very often it's not the board of directors that makes the decisions as to the direction of the organisation. It's the shareholders, and even going beyond that, the financial markets. And very often CEOs, they're not bad people, but they're doing what the shareholders have told them to do. And if they want their bonus, they want their share options, then they're going to do what they've been told to do. What we haven't done is effectively influence and communicate to shareholder communities and financial markets so that they understand that the best way to achieve sustainable growth is by becoming a sustainably customer-centric business.
Okay, now I know that you've been running some masterclasses in 2020, and you're also doing some in Latin America this week.
Yes.
When people are booking your masterclasses, what's one or two of the recurring problems that you've been hearing from people? Like the reason why they come to you in the first place?
One of the reasons they come to me is because I fundamentally am a little bit like them. And what I mean by that is I spent 17 years on the inside of a variety of corporate organisations doing this. So I'm not a career consultant. I'm someone that's been there and done it. And I think what many customer experience practitioners want is to hear from someone that knows what it feels like and has been through all of the challenges. But one of the other reasons that people come to me is that everything that I try to share knowledge about is very practical and very actionable. Anyone can talk theory. It's more about turning it into the practical action that they can do something with. And that's what my knowledge sharing is based on. And I use the word knowledge sharing intentionally because my philosophy is that customer experience is best delivered when it's done by people, not to them. So I want to give people knowledge so they can do this themselves. And the consistent theme, the number one theme, connects back to some of the things we've already discussed. And that is an inability to influence senior leadership to take customer experience seriously. That's one of the biggest issues. In addition, the lack of having a structured approach to making the management of customer experience intentional. So one of the things that I teach is the importance of adopting a framework to do this. It's amazing how few organizations have one. And so very often what I see is that when people spend 2 days with me, they leave the room being much clearer about what they can do to make this very practical and tangible. And the final thing I will say is that the other very important point about what I'm getting across is simplicity. I feel that too many have radically overcomplicated what they're trying to do with customer experience. And what I'm trying to educate people to understand is that you can make fundamental changes if you keep it simple. And so much of what I teach is based on getting out of the detail, seeing what the customer sees, and driving real, practical, demonstrable change.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm at Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.